Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The winter of 1885 had been particularly harsh in the Colorado Territory. Snow blanketed the rugged mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and the wind howled through the pine forests with a ferocity that seemed to strip away all hope. It was in this merciless landscape that a year-old Ayanna found herself alone, abandoned by the very people who should have protected her. The Apache band had been struggling for months. Game was scarce, and the harsh winter had claimed several of the elderly and weak, and the fever took Ayanna's grandmother. The last of her blood relatives, the tribal council made a decision that would haunt them all. Resources were too precious to waste on an orphan child who showed signs of the same sickness that had claimed so many others. "She brings death with her," whispered the medicine man, his weathered face etched with a mixture of grief and necessity. "The spirits have marked her." Ayanna's aunt Ciala had tears streaming down her face as she wrapped the child in a thin deer hide. "Forgive us, little one," she whispered in Apache, her voice breaking. "May the Great Spirit guide you to a better path." The snow fell harder as the band disappeared into the white wilderness, their footprints quickly covered by the relentless storm. Ayanna sat huddled against the massive trunk of a pine tree, her small body shaking uncontrollably. The cold bit through her meager clothing, and her breath came in short, visible puffs that quickly dissipated in the frigid air. She had stopped calling out for her people hours ago. Her voice had grown hoarse, and the wind carried away her cries. Like fallen leaves, she simply wept, her tears turning to ice crystals on her bronzed cheeks. The fever that had claimed her grandmother still burned within her, making her alternate between violent shivering and moments of delirious warmth. 20 miles away, Thomas McKenna urged his horse through the deepening snow. The 42-year-old rancher had spent 3 days in the nearby settlement of Pine Ridge, trading cattle and restocking supplies before winter's grip became too strong. His weathered hands gripped the reins tightly as he navigated the familiar but treacherous mountain path back to his ranch. Thomas had built his life in solitude. After losing his wife and infant son to cholera 7 years earlier, he had retreated to the isolated ranch his father had left him. The work was hard, but it kept his mind occupied and his heart from dwelling too long on what he had lost. Spoke to few people, trusted fewer, and had convinced himself that this was the life he deserved. The wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that made Thomas pull his horse to a sudden stop. He strained his ears, thinking perhaps he had imagined it. But there it was, again a soft, pitiful crying that seemed to pierce through the storm's rage. "Whoa, girl," he murmured to his mare, dismounting carefully in the deep snow. "You hear that too?" He followed the sound, his boots crunching through the pristine white surface. The crying grew louder, more distinct, and Thomas felt his chest tighten with recognition. It was a child's voice, weak and desperate. There, huddled against the base of a towering pine, was a small figure wrapped in animal hide. Thomas approached slowly, his heart pounding. As he drew closer, he could see it was a young Apache girl. Her lips blue with cold, and her dark eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Jesus," he breathed, kneeling beside her. "How long have you been out here, little one?" Yana looked up at the tall, bearded man with eyes that held both terror and a desperate hope. She tried to speak, but only a weak whimper escaped her lips. Her small body was trembling so violently that Thomas feared she might not survive much longer. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her small frame. The coat engulfed her completely, and he could feel how frighteningly cold and small she was beneath the thick fabric. "I've got you now," he said softly, lifting her into his arms. "You're going to be all right." As he carried her back to his horse, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what circumstances had led to this moment. Apache children weren't abandoned lightly there. Culture valued family and community above all else. Something terrible must have happened for her to be alone in this wilderness. He mounted his horse carefully, cradling the girl against his chest. She had stopped crying now, but her breathing was shallow and rapid. The fever was evident in her. flushed cheeks, and Thomas knew that getting her warm and safe was a matter of life and death. The storm seemed to intensify as they made their way toward his ranch, as if nature itself was testing his resolve. But Thomas pressed on, driven by an instinct he hadn't felt in years, the need to protect something precious and vulnerable, as his cabin came into view through the swirling snow. Thomas felt a strange stirring in his chest. For the first time in 7 years, he was bringing someone home. The warmth of Thomas's cabin was a shock to Ayana's system. She had grown so accustomed to the biting cold that the heat from the stone fireplace felt almost painful against her frozen skin. Thomas worked quickly, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he laid her on the wooden floor near the hearth. "Easy now," he murmured, unwrapping the deer hide that clung to her small frame. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes." Ayana's eyes followed his every movement, still wide with fear and confusion. She had never seen a white man up close before, and his pale skin and light beard seemed almost ghostly in the firelight. When he reached for her clothing, she flinched and tried to pull away, whimpering softly. Thomas paused, understanding her fear. "I know you're scared," he said in a low, soothing voice. "But these clothes are frozen solid. We don't get you. Warm and dry, you're going to get sicker." He moved slowly, giving her time to process his intentions. From his chest, he pulled out one of his own flannel shirts, soft from years of wear and washing. He held it up for her to see, then pointed to her wet clothing and shook his head. "Trade?" he asked simply, hoping she might understand the gesture. Ayana's fever-clouded mind struggled to process the situation. This strange man had saved her from certain death in the snow. But years of tribal warnings about white settlers made her instinctively cautious. Yet something in his eyes, a deep sadness that mirrored her own, made her feel less afraid. She allowed him to help her change into the oversized shirt, which fell past her knees like a dress. Thomas then wrapped her in thick wool blankets and settled her into the large leather chair by the fire. The warmth began to seep into her bones, and for the first time in days, she stopped shivering. "There's a good girl," Thomas said, kneeling beside the chair. "Let's see about getting some food into you." He ladled warm broth from a pot that had been simmering on the stove. The rich aroma of beef and vegetables filled the cabin, and Ayana's stomach cramped with hunger. She had eaten nothing but a few berries and snow for the past 2 days. Thomas offered her the spoon, but her hands shook too badly to hold it steady. Without a word, he began feeding her small sips of the broth, his movements patient and careful. Each spoonful brought a little more life back to her dark eyes. "What's your name?" he asked gently, though he knew she probably didn't understand English. Ayana looked at him for a long moment, then placed her small hand on her chest. "Ayana," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ayana," Thomas repeated, and she nodded. Slightly, "That's a pretty name." "I'm Thomas," he pointed to himself. "Thomas." She tried to repeat it, but her pronunciation was thick with her native accent. "Thomas." "Close enough," he smiled, and for the first time since finding her, Ayana's expression softened slightly. As the evening wore on, Thomas continued to care for her with a tenderness that surprised him. He checked her temperature, which was dangerously high, and administered cool cloths to her forehead. He had learned basic medical care from his late wife, who had served as an informal nurse to their community. When Ayana's fever spiked during the night, Thomas carried her to his own bed, where he could monitor her more closely. Chair beside the bed, changing the damp cloths on her forehead and whispering soft reassurances when she cried out in her delirium. "Grandmother," she called out in Apache, her small hands reaching into the darkness. "Don't leave me." Thomas didn't understand the words, but he recognized the anguish in her voice. He took her hand in his, feeling how small and fragile it was. "I'm here," he said quietly. "You're not alone." By the 3rd day, Ayana's fever had broken, and she was able to sit up and take more substantial food. Thomas prepared simple meals, soft bread, warm milk, and gentle stews that wouldn't upset her recovering stomach. He watched her eat with the focused intensity of someone who had been truly hungry, and it broke his heart to think of what she had endured. Communication remained a challenge. but they began to develop a system of gestures and simple words. Thomas would point to objects and say their English names. Ayana would repeat them, her pronunciation improving with each attempt. In return, she taught him Apache words, though he struggled much more with the unfamiliar sounds. "Fire," Thomas said, pointing to the flames in the hearth. "Fire," Ayana repeated, then added, "Co." "Co," Thomas tried, making her giggle softly at his clumsy pronunciation. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and the sound filled something hollow in his chest that he had forgotten existed. Her laughter was like music, pure and innocent, despite all she had suffered as the days passed. Thomas found himself looking forward to these small interactions. Ayana was intelligent and curious, asking questions through gestures and broken English about everything in the cabin. She seemed particularly fascinated by his books, running her fingers over the leather covers and peering at the strange symbols inside. "You want to learn to read?" Thomas asked one evening, noticing her interest. Ayana nodded eagerly, though she wasn't entirely sure what read meant. Thomas pulled out a simple primer he had used to teach his late wife to read English. He opened it to the first page, which showed a large letter A alongside a drawing of an apple. "A," he said, pointing to the letter. "Apple." Ayana studied the symbols carefully, then looked up at him with bright, eager eyes. For the first time since his wife's death, Thomas felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. This child, abandoned and broken, was beginning to heal him somehow and caring for her. He was beginning to heal too. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls had found something neither had expected. Hope, too. Weeks had passed since Thomas found Ayana in the snow, and the cabin had transformed from a place of solitary existence into something resembling a home. The young Apache girl had gained weight and strength. Her bronze skin had returned to its natural, healthy glow, and her eyes now held curiosity rather than fear. Thomas had fashioned proper clothes for her from his own garments, cutting down shirts and pants to fit her small frame. She wore them with a mixture of pride and awkwardness, still more comfortable in the traditional Apache dress she had arrived in, which Thomas had carefully cleaned and mended. "Good morning, Ayana," Thomas said as she emerged from the small alcove where he had set up a bed for her. "Sleep well?" "Good morning, Thomas," she replied, her pronunciation improving daily. "I sleep ... good." Her English was progressing remarkably fast. Thomas had discovered that she was exceptionally bright, absorbing new words and concepts with an eagerness that reminded him of his late wife's thirst for knowledge. Each evening they would sit by the fire as he read to her from his books, her dark eyes following the words on the page as she tried to connect the sounds to the symbols. This morning, however, Thomas noticed something different in her demeanor. She seemed restless, often looking toward the window where the snow had finally stopped falling. The winter sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in weeks, casting long shadows across the pristine landscape. "Ayana," Thomas said gently, "do you want to tell me about your family, your people?" Her expression immediately grew sad, and she looked down at her hands. Thomas had been careful not to push too hard about her past, understanding that trauma needed time to heal, but he could see that she was ready to share something. "My grandmother," she began slowly, searching for the English words. "She gets sick. Very sick. Coughing. Fever." She touched her chest and mimicked the motion of coughing. Thomas nodded encouragingly. "And then I get sick too. Medicine man," he say. She struggled with the concept, then switched to Apache 4. A moment before trying again. "He say I bring death, bad medicine." Thomas felt his jaw clench. He had suspected something like this. The Apache were deeply spiritual people. An illness was often seen as a spiritual imbalance. But to abandon a child, so they left you? He said quietly. Ayana nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "My aunt, she'll cry. She'll say sorry, but ... but they must go. Leave me for spirits to take." Thomas moved closer and knelt beside her chair. "Ayana, look at me." She raised her dark eyes to meet his. "You are not bad medicine," he said firmly. "You are not cursed. Sometimes people get sick, that's just life. It doesn't mean you're bad or wrong. But grandmother dies, she whispered. And I get sick too. And now you're better, Thomas replied. You survived. You're strong. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Your people, they were scared. When people are scared, sometimes they make bad choices. But that doesn't mean they were right. Ayanna considered this, her young mind working through concepts that were foreign to everything she had been taught. In Apache culture, the medicine man's word was law, and spiritual explanations were rarely questioned. But this kind white man was offering her a different way of understanding her world. Why you help me? She asked suddenly. I am Apache. White man. Your people and my people, they fight. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I had a family once, he said finally, a wife and a baby boy. They got sick too, a different sickness, and they died. Ayanna's eyes widened with understanding and sympathy. After that I was angry, Thomas continued. Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at myself. I came here to be alone because I thought I didn't deserve to be happy anymore. Then you find me, Ayanna said softly. Then I found you, he agreed. Maybe. Taking care of you is taking care of the part of myself that I thought was gone forever. That afternoon, Thomas decided it was time to teach Ayanna some practical skills. The snow had stopped, but they were still weeks away from spring. And she needed to learn how to survive in this world she had been thrust into. He showed her how to tend the fire, how to prepare simple meals, and how to care for the animals in his small barn. Ayanna was eager to learn, and Thomas was impressed by her natural intelligence and quick adaptation. In Apache way, she said as they fed the horses. Women know these things. My grandmother taught me to gather plants, to make medicine, to prepare food. Can you show me? Thomas asked, genuinely interested. Ayanna's face lit up with excitement. Yes. But need different plants. Apache plants. Spring plants. When spring comes, you can teach me, Thomas promised. And I'll keep teaching you to read and write English. As they worked together, Thomas found himself amazed by Ayanna's resilience. She had been abandoned by her own people, left to die. In a blizzard, and yet she was still capable of joy, curiosity, and trust. Her laughter filled the cabin at unexpected moments. Her questions kept him on his toes. That evening, as they sat by the fire with their books, Ayanna looked up at Thomas with a serious expression. Thomas, she said, what happened when snow melt? When spring come? Thomas had been dreading this question. He knew that eventually decisions would have to be made about Ayanna's future. The nearest town was small, but word would eventually get out that he was caring for an Apache child. Some people would be accepting, but others, ... I don't know, he answered honestly. What do you want to happen? Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary. I want to stay here, she said quietly. With you, you are ... you are good to me. Thomas felt his heart constrict. Ayanna, there might be people who don't understand, who think it's wrong for me to care for you. Because I am Apache. Because the world is complicated, Thomas replied. But I want you to know something. No matter what happens, you will always have a place here. Always, Ayanna smiled. And for the first time since his wife's death, Thomas felt like he truly had something worth protecting. This brave, intelligent child had brought light back into his life, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Outside, the first stars appeared in the clear winter sky. And inside the cabin, two people who had found each other in the darkness continued to build something neither had expected, a family. Spring arrived in the Colorado Territory with a sudden, almost violent intensity. The snow melted rapidly, turning the mountain streams into roaring torrents and the earth into dew, a muddy, rich canvas ready for new growth. Thomas and Ayanna had spent the winter months building not just survival skills, but a bond that transcended the cultural divide between them. Ayanna, now comfortable with basic English and able to read simple sentences, had become Thomas's constant companion. She helped with the ranch work, tended the garden plot they had planned together, and filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and the hearth. But as the weather warmed and travel became easier, Thomas knew Their isolated sanctuary wouldn't remain secret much longer. His first indication came on a bright morning in April when he spotted a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Pine Ridge. "Ayanna," he called, his voice carrying an edge of concern. "Come inside, please." Planting seeds in their garden, her hands dark with soil. "What is wrong, Thomas?" "We have visitors coming," he said, using her preferred pronunciation of his name. "Stay close to me, all right." The riders were led by Sheriff John Blackwood, a man Thomas knew well enough to respect, but not entirely trust. Behind him rode 3 other men from town: Marcus Webb, the general store owner, Dr. Samuel Hayes, and Reverend Patterson from the small church. "Thomas McKenna," Sheriff Blackwood called out as they approached. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Sheriff," Thomas replied, stepping onto his porch with Ayanna staying close behind him. "What brings you all the way out here?" Marcus Webb, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up first. "We heard rumors in town, McKenna. Folks saying you've got yourself an Indian girl living here." "Her name is Ayanna," Thomas said firmly. "And she's not an Indian girl. She's a child who was abandoned in a blizzard, and I probably saved her life." Dr. Hayes, an older man with kind eyes, dismounted and approached slowly. "Thomas, no one's questioning your intentions. We need to discuss the situation." "What situation?" Thomas asked, though he could feel the tension building. Reverend Patterson, a man Thomas had never particularly liked, stepped forward. "The situation of a white man raising a savage child outside the bounds of Christian civilization." Thomas felt his temper flare, but Ayanna's small hand on his arm kept him calm. "Reverend, I suggest you choose your words more carefully, Thomas." Sheriff Blackwood intervened. "Let's all stay calm here. The fact is, people in town are talking. Some are concerned about the appropriateness of the arrangement. And some," Dr. Hayes added more gently, "are concerned about the child's welfare. Apache children belong with Apache people, don't they?" Ayanna stepped forward, her chin raised with a courage that made Thomas proud. "Excuse me," she said in clear, careful English. "I am Ayanna. I can speak for myself." The men looked surprised to hear her speak English so well. Marcus Webb's mouth actually fell open. "My people," Ayanna continued, "they leave me in snow too. Die. They think I bring death because my grandmother died from sickness. Thomas, he saved me. He'd teach me. He'd care for me. He's my family now." Sheriff Blackwood removed his hat, clearly moved by her words. "Child, that's a difficult situation. But you understand that there are proper channels for these things. Agencies that handle Indian affairs. Agencies that put children in boarding schools far from everything they know," Thomas said sharply. "Agencies that try to kill the Indian to save the man." Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "Thomas has a point, Sheriff. The girl seems healthy and well cared for. And she's clearly intelligent. Look how well she speaks English. She reads too," Thomas added, "and she's been teaching me about Apache medicine and plant knowledge. She's not some savage child. She's a bright, capable young person who's been through trauma." Reverend Patterson scoffed. "Reading doesn't change what she is, McKenna. These people are heathens by nature. They need Christian guidance and proper schooling." "These people," Ayanna said, her voice gaining strength, "know how to heal with plants your doctors never heard of. These people know how to live with the earth, not fight it. My grandmother, she was medicine woman. Should teach me much before she die." Thomas watched with pride as Ayanna stood her ground. In the months they had spent together, she had grown from a frightened, abandoned child into a confident young person who understood her own worth. Sheriff Thomas said, "What exactly are you proposing?" Blackwood looked uncomfortable. "Well, there's talk of contacting the Bureau of Indian Affairs, getting the child placed in proper care. The kind of care that leaves children dead from disease and loneliness in government schools," Thomas asked. "The kind of care that strips away everything that makes them who they are." "Thomas," Dr. Hayes said quietly, "what are you proposing? That you just keep her here indefinitely? Happens when she's older? When she needs to find her place in the world?" Thomas looked down at Ayanna, who was watching him with complete trust. "I'm proposing that we let her choose her own path. She's already told you she wants to stay here. She's learning English, she's learning to read and write, but she's also maintaining her own cultural knowledge. And what about marriage? Marcus Webb asked. What about children? Is she going to marry a white man? Have half-bred children? Thomas stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. Get off my property, Webb, now. Sheriff Blackwood held up his hand. All right, let's all calm down. This conversation isn't going anywhere productive. He turned to Thomas. McKenna, I understand your position, and I can see that the child is well cared for. But you need to understand there are legal issues here. Questions about guardianship, about education requirements, about the girl's future. What if Thomas adopt me? Ayanna asked suddenly, like white people do. The men exchanged glances. It was Dr. Hayes who spoke first. Child, that's not a simple process. There are laws about adoption, especially when it comes to Indian children. But it's possible? Thomas asked. It would require paperwork, court hearings, maybe even approval from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Sheriff Blackwood replied, and there's no guarantee it would be approved. Thomas looked at Ayanna, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. Then, we'll start the process, if that's what you want, Ayanna. Yes, she said firmly. I want to be your daughter. Real daughter. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Thomas and Ayanna stood in the courthouse in Denver. The legal battle had been long and difficult, but Dr. Hayes had proven to be a powerful ally, testifying to Ayanna's health and Thomas's character. Several letters from Pine Ridge residents had supported the adoption, and even Sheriff Blackwood had eventually written a letter of recommendation. Thomas McKenna, the judge said, do you solemnly swear to care for this child as your own daughter, to provide for her education and welfare, and to raise her to be a productive member of society? I do, Thomas replied, his voice steady. Ayanna. The judge continued, do you understand that this man will become your legal father, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails? Yes, sir, Ayanna replied in perfect English. I understand. And by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I hereby grant this adoption. Ayanna McKenna, you are now the legal daughter of Thomas McKenna. As they walked out of the courthouse, Ayanna slipped her hand into Thomas's. Papa, she said, trying out the words she had been practicing. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. That's right, daughter. That's right.
Ow.
Years later, when people asked Thomas about the day, he found Ayanna in the snow. He would tell them it was the day his real life began. And when they asked Ayanna about being abandoned by her tribe, she would say it was the day she found her true family. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Ayanna's knowledge of Apache medicine and plant lore proved invaluable, and she became known throughout the territory as a healer who combined traditional wisdom with modern knowledge. Thomas, meanwhile, found that teaching Ayanna had rekindled his own love of learning together. They had built something neither had expected to find, a family bound not by blood or culture, but by love, respect, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. And in the end, that was enough.
More than enough.